preparadas respecto al tema de descolonización, del problema de descolonización que tenemos en el Caribe específicamente y quizás en otras regiones más. Les quiero presentar a ustedes a un extraordinario ponente con este tema, que es el doctor Corbin Carlyle. El doctor es secretario ejecutivo del Consejo de Presidentes de la Asamblea General de la Organización de Naciones Unidas, especialista en temas de descolonización y es un notable e incansable luchador en favor de las libertades de los pueblos que aún no han alcanzado su independencia. Es un firme aliado de la causa de Bonaire, de Puerto Rico, de las Islas Malvinas y todos los países que luchan por ser libres en América Latina y el Caribe. El doctor es asesor independiente o ha sido asesor independiente del primer ministro de Curazao, asesor del presidente de la Polinesia Francesa, asesor del presidente del Parlamento de Curazao, entre otros cargos. Tiene una multiplicidad de obra escrita, libros, experto en Naciones Unidas, asesor en las Islas Vírgenes, en su quinta convención constitucional, es conferencista, tiene varias publicaciones, como les dije, y varios estudios de análisis en Naciones Unidas. Así que le damos la palabra al doctor Corbin Carlyle. Adelante, doctor, y muchas gracias por estar con nosotros.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a PowerPoint that I presented to the officials, so we can perhaps put that up at this point. But I thank you very much for the invitation to be present at this important conference. Just one slight clarification. My government service was with the government of the Virgin Islands and not the government of Curaçao, although I had done some work with the government of Curaçao several years ago. First of all, I'd like to suggest that just a word about the Council of Presidents of the General Assembly. The Council of Presidents was established at the United Nations headquarters in 1997 as a mechanism to coordinate the collective diplomatic and international experience of its former presidents to support the work of the United Nations. Of the several areas of focus of the Council is the implementation of General Assembly resolutions and decisions, including those on decolonization. So this presentation is in effect in relation to the issue of decolonization and the resolutions of the United Nations. Now we speak of the independence for Latin American countries. The independence for Latin American countries actually began in the early 1800s and progressed throughout the century. The independence of most Caribbean countries came much later, in the latter half of the 1900s. In Latin America and the Caribbean, there remains more non-independent territories than any other region of the world. Colonialism has ended in much of our hemisphere, but there remains the stubborn remnants of empire. As we can note from the independence of the Caribbean countries, beginning in 1958, particularly with respect to the CARICOM countries, from 1968 to 1962, there was a West Indies Federation, a collaboration of countries under one umbrella. It lasted for a very short time, and subsequently countries became independent individually. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Grenada, Bahamas, Suriname in 1975, Dominica, and the rest of those. There's a chart that shows this. If you can go to the next slide, you will see the following one. The next one, próximo, por favor. That, yes. If you can see, that's basically the framework for the countries that became independent in the Caribbean. So you can see that it really began in the latter part of the 20th century. The last country to become independent in the Caribbean and Latin America is St. Kitts and Nevis, or was St. Kitts and Nevis. And that was 1983. So from 1983 to today, there have been no cases of decolonization. The map here indicates our region from the perspective of what we consider to be the wider Caribbean. And the wider Caribbean includes the Caribbean countries on the right side through Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, over to the Central American region, and in Mexico, of course, all the way through to the upper part of Venezuela and also Colombia as well. If we go to the next slide, we will see that there are many of the territories that are very much a part of the Caribbean region in particular. Próximo, por favor. See, that's the dependent areas and subsidiary states of the Caribbean. As you can see, the color-coded differences, and this is something that is, again, in such a small space, we have different political status models that are under various colonial arrangements, and Próximo. And French Guiana, of course, being on the South American coast as a border with Suriname. And finally, the Islas Malvinas, which in fact is considered to be not a decolonization issue, but rather an issue of a sovereignty dispute, even though the Islas Malvinas is on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories. It is very clear, and the clear position of Latin America and the Caribbean is that it has always been an issue of sovereignty. And this is where the discussion, as is now taking place, there are resolutions of the General Assembly of the United Nations that have made it very clear that there needs to be the negotiation initiated. But up to this point, the United Kingdom, as the recognized administering power, has not agreed to continue those negotiations on a substantive level, although there are some discussions on various technical issues. The administering states in Latin America and the Caribbean: France, Netherlands, United Kingdom, United States. This is as of 2022. If we go to the those for the United Kingdom, in the next próximo, por favor, you will find that there are 6 British territories in the Caribbean: Bermuda, Turks and Caicos Islands, Cayman Islands, Virgin Islands under the United Kingdom, Anguilla, and Montserrat. Those are 6 island territories that all of them are on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories. And that is addressed under Article 73 of the United Nations Charter, and also following on from the Decolonization Declaration. We have, yes, those are the 6 dependencies of the United Kingdom in the Caribbean. The next arrangement is that of the Netherlands, and this is an important one, given that the Netherlands has actually 2 dependency models in the Caribbean. First model is that of public entity. Próximo, por favor. Okay, the 3, Bonaire, which Ceiba and St. Eustatius are considered to be public entities, partially integrated into one of the countries of the Netherlands, that is the country of Holland. The autonomous country model, on the other hand, Aruba, Curacao, St. Martin, are in fact, this model is that of autonomy, although the nature and level of the autonomy is not full autonomy, so we're referring to it as semi-autonomous. And both models are subject to review with respect to whether they meet the international standards of full self-government, either through integration in relation to the public entity status or autonomy in relation to the autonomous country status. The French models also, the French have two models in the Caribbean. There's the Overseas Department model of Guyana, French Guyana is known, on the South American coast, Guadeloupe and Martinique. And these models are considered to be fully integrated. The United Nations has recognized them as fully integrated, although there are some discussions about whether that actually applies, particularly in Guyana. The second model is that of a collectivity status, St. Martin and St. Bart's. These are two models that now have a degree of autonomy, although the question of whether that autonomy is actually full is still under consideration. And finally, we have the U.S. model of unincorporated territory, the model of Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands. There are two different models in name, but in reality, the relationship to the United States is one of unincorporated territory. It's characterized by the United States Congress having full authority to make laws for those two territories without their consent and often against their will. And we have many examples of this over time. In fact, the model of the British, which I mentioned earlier, is also a reference to a unilateral authority of the United Kingdom to legislate for the United Kingdom territories, as well as to prevent legislation from being enacted into law if the United Kingdom decides it does not wish for such legislation to be enacted. Now, all of these models come under, and próximo por favor, come under the United Nations Charter, particularly Articles 1, 55, and 33. I'm sorry, 73 of the United Nations Charter, which essentially speaks about the matter of the full measure of self-government, which is the particular countries that administer territories have an international responsibility to bring these territories to the full measure of self-government. It's a sacred obligation. There's also two particular resolutions which were adopted in 1960, what is referred to as the Decolonization Declaration, Resolution 1514, which recognizes that the territories have an inalienable right to self-determination. They have legitimate political options, and they also are required to have a transfer of powers without condition or reservation in advance of their self-determination. In the case of Puerto Rico currently, the issue of transfer of powers is particularly important given that there is now a new process underway in the U.S. Congress to establish a mechanism for self-determination exercise. That is one of very many of the previous options, previous mechanisms that have been attempted but have not yet been given full credence because of one of the issues that the Congress does not wish to agree to the result of a referendum before it knows what the result is. And that causes some difficulty. The new legislation does provide for that, but it is also simply, at this point, a proposal. We will see to what degree the issue is being developed. One of the interesting points of Puerto Rico also is that it is not formally listed on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, which is a list of 17 territories presently. But Puerto Rico is given a specific hearing in the United Nations Special Committee on Decolonization. And the hearing is also concludes with a resolution which is sent to the General Assembly, particularly to the 4th Committee of the General Assembly, and where the request is made for the issue to be taken up. Okay. Now, there are basic standards for full self-government, as I mentioned. In particular, there is a Resolution 1541, which provides for 3 options that provide full political equality. These are independence, free association, and integration. and there are minimum standards for these arrangements. Independence, of course, must be for full political equality and equal status, rights of citizenship for the people within the independent state. Free association or autonomy, on the other hand, genuine autonomy will be the result of a free and voluntary choice by the people, and also that they would have the right to determine their internal constitution without external interference. And finally, integration, which should be on the basis of complete equality between the people of the territory and the countries in which it is integrating. We have one example, as there are a number of examples in the Caribbean, whereby there have been models that have been promoted as attaining full self-government. In the case of the West Indies Associated States, which were the smaller countries in the Eastern Caribbean, there was a model known as the West Indies Associated States, but when it was presented to the United Nations, it was determined that it did not meet the criteria of full autonomy. Subsequently, each of the countries, as part of that association, became independent, and that leading up to the final one in 1983, St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, where we are in the context of decolonization in this hemisphere and also in the Pacific, where the remaining territories are located for the most part. We also have Gibraltar in Europe. But we have a situation where decolonization has moved to a dependency legitimization because of the fact that there has been no movement since 1983. There is a tendency now to promote the legitimization of the current arrangements, even if they do not provide for full political equality. So we have identified 3 areas in terms of the periods of history since the adoption of the United Nations Charter. From 1946 to 1960, we have the decolonization engagement period. This was a particularly important period because the international criteria for full self-government was just beginning to be formed. So a number of territories, in fact, were removed from the United Nations jurisdiction at that time, even though because they were given, they were removed because their arrangement was considered self-governing at that early period. Puerto Rico in 1954 and the Netherlands Antilles in 1955. And these were arrangements that were removed from the United Nations colonial territory list because there was the suggestion that they had achieved full self-government, and there was a fair amount of misinformation, particularly with respect to the United Nations debate on Puerto Rico, whereby the territory was promoted as an autonomous, fully autonomous country, and in fact, as we know, that is not the case. The second period from 1960 to 1990 was referred to as the acceleration period. This is where most of the territories that were considered colonial at the time became independent or freely associated. And finally, we are in the period from 1990 through today, which is the stagnation period. And again, this had much to do with the end of the Cold War. And the Cold War, of course, ended in the early right at the beginning of the 1990s. It coincided with the independence of Namibia, which was the largest country at the time to become independent. And finally, the territories remaining were perceived as small islands not prepared for independence nor expressing an interest in independence. And the situation essentially changed to no longer seeking to promote the self-determination and independence of these territories, but rather to seek to legitimize the political inequality that they were existing under. Most of these arrangements, of course, did not meet international standards, and so there's a tendency, in fact, up to today, to seek to legitimize political inequality, and that's what is being discussed at the United Nations very often. Now, in just concluding observations, contemporary dependency governance arrangements which are characterized by political inequality, do not meet the requisite standards of democratic governance required under the United Nations Charter. And we speak of democratic governance in the context of self-determination, in the context of human rights, and in the context of decolonization. The primary reason for the failure of the decolonization process in this stagnation period is the lack of implementation of the United Nations decolonization mandate. Member states of Latin America and the Caribbean can advance the decolonization process at the United Nations to end contemporary colonialism in our hemisphere, and this would be a particular call for member states to proceed and accelerate their work at the United Nations level. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carlyle. I just wanted to ask you if you could share with us your presentation. Is it possible? If you could share, you can share it with us. Yes, it was an excellent exposition. Thank you very much.